Hello and welcome. This is The Green Room by Deloitte, a podcast where we ask the tricky questions about the world around us. I'm Dara Latinwo, and you're listening to episode 11, where we ask, are our cities ready for the future? Welcome to this week's episode of The Green Room. This week, I'm joined by my co-host, Ethan Worth. Dream team back again, together.
Dream team back. Hi, Dara. I was thinking, as George is away, I can do his fact of the day or fact of the week that he likes to do.
Go for it.
So, really important episode this week. In the 1800s, the amount of people that lived in cities was 1 in 30. It's now over 1 in 2 and projected to be 70% of the whole world's population by 2050. So really important that the future of our cities is right.
I'm just feeling like we're going to be quite crowded. Like, I just need a bit more space because it's panicking me in London, like rush hour. There are already too many people for my liking. I'm in armpits and it's just
I think
great.
With smart cities, it'll be fine. It'll all be automated and the air will be clean and everything will be great. As we'll find out in our episode, I'm sure.
Probably, okay. So do you want to introduce the guest that we have today to talk about these cool smart city things?
So today we're joined by Jasmine Whitbread. Jasmine is the CEO of London First, an organisation which convenes business leaders to keep the UK's capital globally competitive and working for the whole country. Hi, Jasmine.
Hi, morning.
And we're also joined by Simon Bedford. Simon is a real estate partner at Deloitte and our lead for smart cities. He's worked on some major development projects to help build successful cities across the UK and abroad. Hi, Simon.
Hello, good to see you.
Good to see you. And I think we'll also start today by taking a look in our icebreaker bucket.
It's my favourite part.
So I will just see what today's question is. If you could live anywhere in the world for a year, where would it be? Quite nice and apt, I think, to this pod.
It's a great question, and given the fact that I spend most of my time thinking about cities, I suddenly think to myself, well, which one will be my favourite? I think it will probably be Chicago. I would never tire of being in Chicago. It's got quite an interesting climate. I'll be very hot for some of the year and I'd be extremely cold for the rest of it. But I'd spend most of my time looking up at those wonderful buildings on the shoreline of Lake Michigan, so that's where I'd be for a year.
Great choice. I've always wanted to go to Chicago. How about you, Jasmine?
Well, London, of course. I mean, what do you expect me to say?
Else.
I'm a Londoner, but I actually spent most of my life living outside of the UK. In the States, in places like Boston, in Dakar in Senegal, in Kampala in Uganda, and I'm really happy now to be living back in London. It's just such a fantastic, vibrant global city and I love it.
How about you, Dara?
I think probably Kuala Lumpur, KL in Malaysia. So I went 8 years ago and I was just blown away because it's just this incredible mix of East and West. And like, there's one moment that really stands out in my mind. So I was walking, I went with a friend, and we were both 19 at the time and just sort of wet behind the ears. And we were just walking on a highway, sort of innocently, just minding our own business. And then we found like this little sort of cabin door, and it led randomly into a rainforest in the middle of the city. And so we were just there, like eyes agog, just going, wow, like literally making the sound, wow. Because, compared to London, you don't just randomly walk into a rainforest. And so that stayed with me for almost like a decade. And I think if a city can do that, like I need to be in that city.
So maybe one of the criteria for the cities of the future.
I think it has to be. It has to be.
So I think for me it would be Melbourne. So I lived in Sydney for about 6 months, and the whole time I was there, everyone told me how much cooler Melbourne was. Then I finally went a week later and kind of regretted my choice. So I think I would like to go back and live there for a year. Sydney's cooler twin. That would be my choice.
Okay, so back to this week's topic. Are our cities ready for the future? So since the time of Dick Whittington and even before, there's been this sense that cities are the place where it's all happening, where it's at. So why are our cities so important? Let's start with you, Jasmine.
Yeah, I mean, in that long sweep of history, of course, you're right. But up until really the early 90s, certainly the late 80s, London itself and many of our great cities were really their populations were being hollowed out. The accepted wisdom at the time was everyone wants to move out of the city centre, they want to get into the suburbs, they don't want to live in the cities. So actually this current phenomena and the rise of London and other great capital cities as destinations where talent from around the world and around the country want to come and live and work or at least visit is actually something that we shouldn't be taking for granted and that we need to really look after, because it doesn't have to be that way. And it's not so long ago for those of us who are a little bit older than you are to remember that London did go through a period where it was really in the doldrums.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make. If you think that the UK through the 1980s went through a post-industrial, effectively, recession, as the whole of our economy changed, effectively going from steel and coal and those good things into what we see now, which is a completely different economy. The cities they suffered dramatically from that change. We've had to work really hard, as Jasmine said, to actually attract people back into cities, and now we have this situation where it seems as though most people would like to live in a city, but it wasn't always thus. The important point you make around making sure that the place is attractive enough for people to feel as though they can make it their home for all of their life, not just a piece of it, I think is something we've got to think about, because our cities have certainly become attractive to younger people, but they haven't still necessarily been a destination that people would see as somewhere they're going to live for the whole of their lives. And that's quite important to the sustainability of the current situation we have with us at the moment.
So is that some of the trends we're seeing? Are we seeing that more people are spending their whole life in major cities, or are we still currently seeing people moving out? And how do you think that will change in the future?
Well, I think and I'll let Jasmine talk about London, because she will know a lot more about London than I certainly do. But I think in terms of some of the UK's other cities, the ones that are growing actually quite rapidly at the moment, it is still the case that people would make different choices around certain parts of their life, and probably would still look to move to more suburban or rural locations to bring up family, for example. Rather than necessarily stay in the city. So that's something that we've got to look at, because if we are going to continue to grow our cities, and indeed to make them places where everybody should feel as though they can be there for the whole of their lives, then we've got to look at things like schools, we've got to look at health, we've got to look at public realm and public open space, we've got to make cities attractive to everybody. And that is still a challenge, I think, for cities across the UK.
I mean, that's still the case in London as well. I mean, obviously there are differences, but for quite some time, over 30-year-olds have been moving out when they start to think about possibly having a family, wanting a bit of outdoor space. And so that can become a drain on talent at just the right moment when you need somebody who's sort of developed in their career and is really starting to become very productive. And then potentially is looking to move out. I mean, what we're actually seeing today is even under 30-year-olds sort of thinking twice before actually committing to try and finding a place to live that they can afford in London. And that really is an issue for the future health of our capital. I mean, the only other thing that I would say is that we're in the middle of a big sort of consultation, talking far and wide with our members and stakeholders and others about what would the future of London look like. We're going to get onto that, I'm sure, but one of the things that we're hearing from particularly the next generation, kids just in business school now and thinking about their careers ahead, is that they don't see it such a binary choice in terms of live in the city or outside of the city. They'd like to. They imagine a world where it can be much more fluid, and where they maybe come into work in London for a couple of days or 3 days, and certainly enjoy the nightlife while they're in town, and then are able to spend some time outside of London and using technology actually to be able to do that. Still working for the same employer, but making sure that they're connected, and that comes on to the sorts of things that we're going to need in the future.
Definitely. And just purely from a selfish perspective, as an under 30 who is considering whether to stay in London or not, and obviously there's the housing prices and everything. Just what are your views on why that trend might be starting to appear and what can be done about that?
The trend of
under 30s looking elsewhere out of London.
I mean, I think that the house prices is by far there are other issues. I mean, I think we hear about air pollution and other things, but by far it's the cost of housing and the fact that London just simply doesn't have sufficient housing. I think the Mayor has a plan. The Mayor's plan shows that we should be building 65,000 new homes every year just to meet current demand, and we're consistently only meeting about half of that build. And there simply isn't enough money being put behind that. There isn't enough land being brought forward. We're not thinking creatively enough about better ways of building in order to meet that target. And that means you've got a real supply side problem. There's just not enough housing coming onto the market, which in turn drives up prices and prices young people in particularly out of the market.
I think there's a further dimension that should be brought into the debate about the attractiveness of London. Clearly London's a global city. There are 4 or 5 cities that operate at the level that London operates across the whole of the world, and therefore it is a magnet to many from all different parts of life, and the demand that places on the city is immense. The affordability issue therefore becomes one that is not just about people who work in London, but people who want to invest in London. And there are 2 different dimensions at play here. What's interesting, I think, is that there wasn't in the UK particularly necessarily a choice for lots of people about where they wanted to work and live. You needed to be in London because that's where you needed to be. And I think another dimension that we have got in front of us now is that there are cities across the UK and in other parts of the world that have become places where people have said, well, maybe I can forge a life and a career for myself there that isn't London. Dublin's a good example I think, at the moment, and Manchester will be another good example. Cities that are actually creating a choice. So we are beginning to see a little bit of that, and at the same time recognising that there is a global piece to the jigsaw puzzle, and then there is more of a national piece to the jigsaw puzzle. And I think we need to look at all these things as we look to the future.
Definitely, and I think it's really interesting you mentioned Manchester, because one of the statistics that I read about in our Deloitte Crane survey is that the amount of new builds in Manchester is higher than any US city last year, which I thought was unbelievable.
Well, there are more cranes in Manchester than there are in any US city. That's right. Toronto, I think, obviously not in the US, but North American city just tops Manchester, because that's a city that's growing very, very rapidly. But Manchester's going through quite a renaissance, and for those who haven't been able to get the train up to have a look, I would encourage it, because there is a huge amount of building there. Now, that's a city that has got the room. So it did go through a terrific, well, not terrific in a good way, but it did go through a very big recessionary period. And actually through that, a lot of space is actually available to build. It's now all being filled up. With a strong university sector, which it has, that has enabled the city to retain more talent than perhaps it had done in the past. And that is creating a different opportunity for that city. So these cities that are not global but have aspirations to be a little more than national are doing quite well at the moment.
I can affirm that, because I was in Manchester just a couple of weeks ago for a conference at the University of Manchester, and it's just a really buzzy city. There are a lot of cranes when you look out over the rooftops. It's a lot going on. But the thing that I was quite interested by is the thing that you and Jasmine both keep on mentioning, what makes a city attractive, the idea of London as a world city. So for both of you, how would you define what makes a world city, what makes a successful city? Perhaps they're one and the same thing, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think it's its people, isn't it? And London has become a great global capital because of its great global people. I mean, a third all Londoners were born outside the UK. And, that's from, every country in the world virtually. And you've got all those languages spoken here, all those talents. Anything is possible in this great city of ours. And, when I went and talked to our members when I first started at London First about just over 2 years ago, and was asking them, it was just after the referendum, and asking them sort of what did they want to see out of the Brexit negotiations. They said, you know, Jasmine, it doesn't really matter what happens on that front, as long as we can continue to have access to the global talent that we need. Yes, we're going to do more to skill up young Londoners, in fact, you know, UK-born workers of all ages, and we recognise we need to do that, but we must continue to have access to that really, in some cases, quite specialised talent, and in other cases where you simply got shortages. So whether it's, you know, chefs or construction workers or carers, you know, we simply don't have enough of them. And so that's important for business as much as it is for society. So it is all about London's people, and then the creativity and the kind of vibrancy that creates by having such an amazing set of people all in one place.
As a Londoner, I'm just smiling hearing all of this. I'm like, yes, I am part of the reason why London is special. I love it. What about you, Simon?
I think that's all right. If you looked at most of the indexes to what people say are their favourite city or the place they might be the happiest in the world, cities like Vienna do very well. Helsinki, mainly the Nordics, actually, one way or the other. You know, the sort of cities across Scandinavia.
It's
and
their cakes. That's
pardon?
Why
it's the cakes. It could be.
Yeah,
it could be their cakes.
Vienna,
it could be their cakes, or it could be a combination of things that are that I think are the key for a city actually really, really being at the top of the tree. It's about wealth creation and productivity. So if you looked at the cities that do well, they tend to do very well in that space. So economics is important, but if you looked at those cities, they're all very beautiful. They all have fantastic sort of parks and great landscapes. I'm not sure they've got tropical rainforests, but they probably have quite a lot of trees. They have the best of the old and the best of the new. They have great culture. London has all those things, obviously, but some of those other cities have them too. And I think when we look at what we should aspire to, those are the sorts of reference points that I think we should be using, and it's achievable.
One of the challenges that with our cities, and this was something that kind of I found quite mind-blowing, is that even though our cities cover only about 3% of the Earth's landmass, they use around 60 to 80% of the energy, and they produce 75% of carbon emissions, which is, for me, kind of mind-blowing. You know, so how is it that we are able to kind of make our cities a bit more sustainable? And is smart city technology part of that?
I mean, that absolutely is linked to the point that I was making about connectivity, that people are saying that they want greater connectivity, whether that's, you know, fast broadband or whether that's fast train services, but they want that connectivity. And, you know, done well, that will also address, you know, this is, I totally agree. Everyone's got great concerns. In fact, the recent protests here in London, you know, there were some local businesses whose business was affected, but actually most of the business community was pretty supportive, I found. As long as they kept their hands off our tube, that was the only thing which they did in the end. One of the cleanest forms of transport there is, by the way. But yeah, I think that is something that we're seeing as another issue that's really coming up the agenda through our consultation, is sustainability in the widest sense of the word.
So one of the things that Deloitte have been producing over the last 2 years is something called a Global Cities Mobility Index. Why would we do that? Well, the biggest issue that we face in this particular space is about cars, and about how many people use cars and the emissions that are generated by cars. London, funnily enough, doesn't have a particular problem in this space. I mean, it's a congested city, but comparatively speaking, it does very well. Most people travel to work in London by public transport, and it's got a fantastic bus network, which it runs at a very cheap price. Brilliant. Your average US citizen, I learned last week, spends 96 hours a year sitting in their car but not moving. Wow. 96 hours a year sitting in their car not moving. That's the average. There are 300 million Americans. You can just start doing the maths, as Donald would say, and you know, you begin to get to or math, yeah, you begin to get to quite a serious problem. If you talk to an American about their car, they would say, you know, we're going to have at least two.
They love their cars.
They love their cars. If you were in Central Europe and you said to the citizens of Poland or the Czech Republic or Lithuania, you know, you really need to stop driving. They might say, we've only just started driving, because the car can be quite a status symbol. And so it's quite easy for some cities to deal with this issue, because they have good systems and good mobility networks and good public transport. Scandinavia, again, does well in this space. For other cities, it's much, much more challenging, and there is a cultural issue to address as well. So there's a huge distance to travel, I think, on congestion and indeed the emissions that go with it. The one thing that is for sure is that there is now a movement, a real movement that is growing exponentially. I think you saw how well the Greens did in the recent European elections. This is something that is not going away. So the challenge, I think, for cities is to work out the way in which they can use new technologies, the way in which they can adopt new systems, and actually also work with citizens to look at different ways of moving to enable us to get more people out of those cars. That, I think, is an absolute priority for the smart cities population, if you like, community.
What you said about America really resonated, because having been to different cities, Atlanta, and you look and it's designed around car use. And I'm doing quite a bit of work in the Middle East at the moment, and it's the same thing there in Dubai and in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. You'll ask someone, how can I get to this? Or how far is this? They'll be like, 10 minutes. You're like, oh, great. And you start to, get up, to walk. And they're like, no, Dara, by car. And then you just sag back into your seat and say, okay, I'll just Uber Eats my lunch in. Because everything, they've built the city around car use. And the really interesting thing is how that's impacting health outcomes, because people can't incorporate walking into their day like we do in London. And so that's actually having an impact on obesity levels, which are steadily rising in that region. So I think it's something quite interesting how the city can actually impact the health of its people. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, is that something that we can begin to think about with sustainability, and can smart city tech help there as well?
Yeah, I mean, so you're absolutely right. London, in comparison, we've got this great public transport network, and actually in the mayor's transport strategy, he's very explicit that the number one preferred modus of travel is by walking. So there's a big effort to try and make the city more walkable, more friendly to walkers. But there is still an issue around air quality. I mentioned that earlier. That is rising up. Citizens' agenda, even in particularly in London. Certainly, the mayor's very focused on it. But it is encouraging. So the ULEZ, the ultra low emission zone, was just introduced in London recently to try and address that. It'd be a step in the right direction. I think we all expected that there would be more, rebellion against that, if you like, or complaints, but it's amazing how smoothly that all went. I think we can all take some encouragement from the fact that people are up for changing their habits, even when it's a bit of a pain.
And Dara's mentioned the phrase smart city technology a few times. So maybe if one of you could shed some light on what a smart city actually is, what we mean by that term.
I think there's lots of different definitions, but I think what we're talking about is sort of the melding together of digital technology and all of the potential that has with data science, as you were saying, to improve the urban environment. And I think, in some ways, London is starting from a decent point on that. So I think the next year is going to be the 10-year anniversary of the London Data Bank. And all of the TfL's, Transport for London's data about passenger transport availability, you're talking about buses and trains and so on, is all available on that. Uber is putting their data into the public domain as well. There's other sources of data, but I think what we'd like to see is, as we come up to the 10-year anniversary, you really use the next year to develop more of a vision of what that data bank could look like in the future, and how data could be harnessed in order to ensure that we're not getting unintended consequences of some of the kind of technological developments that we're seeing. And as you say, I think London is we are trying to, I'm somehow involved with the mayor's electric charging point commission to try and get, make sure we've got a plan to ensure that there is sufficient availability of those charging points, because you have to think ahead. You can't just sort of sit with where we are now, and that's inevitably that is coming. And in fact, there's a desire. I think there's more pent up desire, including from companies like Uber, to switch to electric vehicles. But you've got to have the infrastructure in place. I think that's the case in across the board. The infrastructure is absolutely vital. And I think I mentioned earlier about connectivity. Trying to roll out, faster broadband across a city like London, where you've got, all these different boroughs with all their different sort of, governance and policies and, sign-offs that are needed, is more difficult than it should be. And I think, really getting that infrastructure in place that enables this smart city we shouldn't sort of take that for granted. It's not quite there yet.
Yeah.
So, the smart cities, it's such a nebulous term. I think the couple of things to say. I mean, smart cities had their sort of first coming about a decade or so ago. And people talked about smart cities as everything that was going to sort of be there for us in the future. And I think it sort of went a bit, it didn't resonate at the time. Nobody really understood what the term meant. I think today we're in a very different space because technology has advanced so much actually over the last decade, much, much more so than people would probably imagine, that actually technology is now there and available and can be used to enable us to do things that we couldn't previously have thought were possible. And to me, most of the things that you would want to do in a city, which will be around moving people's transport choices into different modes, will be about making their home cheaper and more efficient to run, so using less energy, making it easy to work agilely. I think that's a word.
It's a word here, definitely.
Okay, that's good. So this point around, 2 days here, 2 days there, 1 day somewhere else. You could not have done that a decade ago. It wasn't possible. You had to sit behind a desk. Believe it or not, I know you won't remember, but I do.
I won't tolerate that now.
No, but so what we've got now is the possibility of using technology to enable the city to move forward into new spaces much more effectively than it could do previously. I think the problem in somewhere as complex as the UK is in two parts. One, it's around governance and the ability for the mayor, let's say of London in this context, to say, this is what I want us to do and get everybody else to do it. And the other point is about money and being able to invest ahead of the curve in the infrastructure that is required to deliver that platform that people want. So these are the two big challenges that are in front of us. It's not a challenge that every country or city has. For example, in Norway, in Oslo, most people already drive an electric vehicle. So they're the city that has most electric vehicles proportionately per head of anywhere in the world. Why? Because you get a big tax break if you have an electric car. So the government have actually given you as the person the ability to acquire an electric vehicle, and they're giving you a tax break to do that. They can afford it. In Portugal, where we as Deloitte have been doing a lot of work in the city of Cascais, they also have made massive advances in the way in which they developed their city. What did they do there? The mayor said, this is what I want to do with my city, and he divided the portfolio of tasks that he had between two people. One guy looks after everything they already have. He's called the director of the present. And the other guy, he looks after everything they're going to do in the future, and he's called the director of the future. There are only two directors in that city. One looks after everything they have, all the built assets, and the other guy, his only job is to look at how they're going to move that city forward.
Do they have a big fight about digging up the roads?
Yeah, I'm sure they do, because clearly the guy who's running the future, they're both men, funnily enough, but he wants obviously to link all of the different data sets together to enable people to access, let's say, every piece of transport they can off the smart card. well, that's done. They've done that. That's now actually in the present. He's on to some new things now, maybe in the health space or education. But they could do that because they had the governance structure that enabled them to do that. And I think the problem or challenge for the UK is the complexity of the way that the cities are run, and also the lack of forward funding to enable some of these technology platforms to be put in place.
A devolution of some more powers and money to the city level is something that's good for all of our cities in the UK, and we're all sort of pulling together on and trying to kind of make that argument, because then, you know, there'll be, I mean, obviously some revenues are going to have to continue to go, you know, centrally, but a little bit more power and ability to sort of raise and spend in line with what's needed at the city level means that, as well as coming up with a vision, I mean, you know, our mayor here in London has set out a lovely vision for a roadmap to make London the world's smartest city. I've got it here in front of me, and you know, it includes some good stuff in here, including, you know, bigger issues that some of we've talked about, but also, you know, some specific suggestions that he'd want to see, you know, like lampposts incorporating air quality sensors, you know, publicly accessible Wi-Fi and electric vehicle charging points. So, you know, there's some vision there, but there's, you know, exactly to your point, it's very difficult to then sort of back that with the funding that's needed to make that happen.
So there needs to be that empowerment at the city level so that you get, you know, the kind of traction that you're seeing in Qashqai, because that sounds brilliant. As well, the simplicity of the titles, Director of the Present, Director of the Future, does what it says on the tin.
It's neat.
So we've spoken about how technology has changed so much in the last 10 years that we are now conceiving of things that we couldn't possibly have done a decade ago, smart lampposts, charging pods on every corner, those kind of things. But what do you think is the most radical change that we'll see in our major cities in the next 10 to 20 years? Or some of the radical things?
Well, I don't think we're necessarily going to know what they are, but what I'm very excited about is seeing what happens when this next generation of young leaders across the city, whether it's here in Deloitte or in government or, you know, every level, you know, all of our members at London First, it's really interesting, are very focused now on diversity, and, you know, really boosting and doing everything they can to get diversity coming up through their organisations, and recognising that it's not where they want it to be yet, it's not at the top of the organisations. Yeah. But I think, you know, as we were visioning out what kind of London, you know, can we envisage in the next, you know, 10, 20, 30 years, those people are going to be running the show. And we can't predict exactly what that means, but I think it is going to be, it will mean, if it goes well, and how we're all wanting it to go, it will mean that those sort of diverse perspectives will start getting put into action, and it gives me great hope for the future.
So I think that's the most difficult question you've asked so far in this session. I think the way I would answer it is to say you've got to look back to look forward, and lots of the cities that we celebrate have been with us for hundreds of years. Dubai only 40 years, I accept, but most cities have a backstory, if you like. As we look forward, undoubtedly those cities are going to change. But my suspicion is they won't change as much as you think they will, because that's not what we've seen over the last century or so. I think undoubtedly what we are going to see is a much stronger focus from the newer generations who are populating our cities on things like the environment, on things like air quality, and that will change the way our cities look and feel, I am sure, over the next couple of decades. So this point about climate and climate change, climate crisis, is definitely one that is going to resonate, I think, for a period of time to come.
Just picking up on Jasmine's point about diversity and inclusion, which I think is a really interesting one, how do we make sure that our cities are really nicely integrated so that they don't end up, you know, sort of like the Paris model, where you have a wealthy coterie at the centre and then really kind of low income communities, you know, around it, or sort of more controversially like San Francisco, where you have more billionaires that you can shake a stick at, but at the same time quite a galling housing or homeless crisis there. How do you integrate communities better?
I mean, that is, I talked earlier about the themes that are coming through from the consultation that we're doing, and people, absolutely critical, diversity and inclusion, connectedness, being globally competitive. Place is the one thing we haven't really talked about, and that is very much on people's minds, and people are looking for places that are integrated, that do have, that aren't ghettos for just young people or old people or richer people, or people are looking for actually what London is really good at its best, vibrant, kind of surprising places where you've got maybe a bit of street art going on, and you maybe do have some fancy apartments, but you've also got families living and kids going to the local school. That is what people are looking for, and it's what developers are really thinking about now. So that's going to be a big part of that positive vision, I think, that I'm hoping for London.
I think London's in a better place than many other cities.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
In the context that you describe. I think for other cities it remains a tremendous challenge. I mean, if there was two words that people are going to talk about a lot over the near term, it's going to be social inequality. I think you'll hear that. I think we've just heard it in the Kerslake report that we had last Friday. This is something for the UK. It's not just the UK, but it's something we're really going to have to focus on, because it's not easy to solve the challenge that you describe.
Mm-hmm. And Jasmine, you mentioned connectivity quite a lot during this recording, and I think there's a case study in Medellin which was having that problem of these really violent, ripped apart by drug conflicts areas of that city. And all they did was they connected all the areas via cable car, so the middle class areas were connected to the poorer areas, and then they had some shared public space, and already they're seeing integration now a decade on. So that connectivity point, I think, is really important.
And that's a good point, because that's physical connectivity. We tend to obsess about the sort of online connectivity, but physical connectivity is really, really important. So, I'd say another key thing is going to be for London is continuing to invest in our infrastructure. I think that's really important as well. I mentioned Brexit in passing earlier on, but as we go through this period of uncertainty, which is definitely affecting business confidence, and investment decisions are being put on hold, hiring decisions are being put on hold. There is a sort of drip of negative impacts on London. All the more important for the government to get a grip and continue with the things that is totally within our control. So infrastructure investment, the National Infrastructure Commission has made its recommendations in terms of what the government should be investing in on a national basis, including in our cities and in London. It is calling for a minimum of 1.2% of GDP to be spent on infrastructure. We all know it's proven that investment will have a payback, both in the immediate term in terms of jobs, etc., but also in the longer term in terms of productivity. And that needs to be acted on. So for London, that means Crossrail 2, getting Crossrail done, but then Crossrail 2. But it's not either or. It's also got to be, Northern Powerhouse Rail and, all the other transport investments that we need to see across our great cities in this country.
So I feel like we've covered quite a lot of ground. So I think we're ready to come back now to this week's big question. Are our cities ready for the future? Simon?
Not entirely. I think that if you looked across the world at different cities, and we've touched on a whole number of them during this conversation, we would recognise that we're doing very well in some aspects of the way in which our cities are planning for the future, but not everything. So my view would be that we're partially ready for the future, but there's an awful lot more we could do. We should be positive, but cities have many, many challenges, and we need to make sure that we stay up with the very best practice in delivering what our residents of cities want.
So cautiously optimistic.
I would agree with that, but I think the one thing I would say is it sort of comes back to the people point, really. So talent from around the world, but also skills, really skilling up our current workforce, our future workforce. School leavers need to be coming out and going into the workforce with the skill set, the digital skill set, the soft skills that will enable them to make us ready for the future.
Perfect. Thank you very much for joining us on this week's episode.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. Next time, tune in as we ask our next big question. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad and hosted by George Parrott, Lizzie Elston, Ethan Worth and Dara Latinwo. Thanks to our creative studio for their technical support. Original music by Ali Barrett from our consulting team.